Hello, everyone. Welcome to our semi-annual policy and advocacy update. We're on just a little bit early here because we want to make sure that everybody's going to be on board. But I'm going to welcome in our special guests in the next few moments. I am Matt Kaplan, former host of Planetary Radio, now the Senior Communications Advisor to the Planetary Society. Welcoming all of you, our members, who, as I posted a few minutes ago, I think we'll have even more reason to be proud of your society after you hear the report that's about to come to us today from Jack Corrali and Casey Dreier. And I see that Jack is already on board, so I'm going to invite him in as a speaker. And with any luck, Jack, we'll see you pop in here in a moment. And we are also being backed up by Nicole in our development department, and she will be feeding us some of your questions and maybe posting a few good things for us to take a look at in the chat. Casey's also with us now. Hi, Casey. I just invited you in as a speaker. So we'll kill time here for another minute or so. Hello,
hey,
Jack.
Can you see me?
I can see you and hear you. Thank goodness.
Fantastic.
That was a little bit of a challenge yesterday, as Jack knows. We were having some technical difficulties as we tested out the system, but all appears to be well now, I'm glad to say. And Jack, I think we'll be joined here any moment by Casey. Whoop. I must have accidentally, these names pop in so fast that when I click on somebody, sometimes someone else pops in. And I click on that. Casey, I've just tried again to invite you in. So for our Canadian and international members, apologies for the U.S.-centric tie here. But after all, we are just over 2 weeks away from an event in the United States that is going to change a lot. A lot of work for Jack, a lot of work for Casey, a lot of work for all of us. And really, no matter what the outcome is, there are going to be big changes in store. Casey, welcome. And I look forward to talking. Oh, no audio, Casey. Give it another try. That was one of the other.
Yeah, how about now?
There you go. Now you're with us. Okay. So Casey Dreier, policy and advocacy lead for the Planetary Society, my colleague for many years, a much more recent addition to the staff, but someone who's been doing his best for the Planetary Society for a very long time, Jack Corrali. And Jack is our Director of DC Operations, and he joins us as well. And now I think we can probably get started since it's about a minute after the hour. Guys, I thought we'd start on a congratulatory note, not just for NASA and the other people behind the Europa Clipper mission, but to all of us at the Society, including our members, because that is a mission that is now on its way to Jupiter. Hurrah.
It feels unreal in a way. And I hope some of the members here who are watching may have gotten emails from me 10, 12 years ago asking for them to write letters to Congress, to the president, to take action, to donate, to come to Washington, D.C. And if you did, maybe just mention that in the chat and allow everyone to say thank you and please accept my deep thanks. This is something that has been fun to reflect on the last few weeks as we've approached the launch. For anyone who heard my interview with Sarah on Planetary Radio, this was a long time coming, and it was the first big project that I led at the Planetary Society after I joined in 2012, the summer of 2012. And at the time, it seemed impossible, pushing this mission up the hill. NASA's budget was going down. Planetary Science's budget was being hammered. It had dropped by a fifth in 1 year, had been projected to be flat, no new money coming. And it wasn't the top, it was the second highest recommendation of flagship missions after Mars, what became Mars Perseverance. And over again, we were told, particularly by higher ups at NASA and the administration, that there's just no money for this, the money wouldn't come. I like to highlight the fiscal year 2014 NASA budget request, which goes out of its way to say what NASA will not do, which is bizarre. I always thought they said, we will not fund an outer planets flagship mission. We will not go to Europa. The next year, they requested their first 15 million, and the project started building from there. So a lot can change. And I think that's the important thing we'll keep in mind right now as we discuss some of the challenges presenting themselves to space exploration and space science, that even if it's tough right now, sustained public pressure, sustained citizen advocacy can play a really important role. And missions like Europa Clipper, again, don't just happen. We tend to see the beautiful pictures of them, the science data that comes back. But I mean, everyone here is a Planetary Society member, so you know that it takes a lot of work to design and build these. But it also takes a lot of work to build the political coalition to enable them to happen. So it was just an amazing moment to see that mission launch after everything that it's like all of nature lined up against it, it seems like, with the hurricane. But it's on its way. It's incredible, and I can't wait to see what we discover at Europa.
Jack, I assume you fully concur.
I do. I mean, it's something that it's funny how history repeats, or rhymes rather. We're in a difficult position right now, and it just goes to show that as the cycles of budget ebbs and flows happen, sustained advocacy from the public, from the space enthusiast community, can really move the ball. And we've seen that just in the last couple of years, but I think Europa Clipper is sort of going to be this, patron saint, really, of how advocacy can affect the science program at NASA.
Well, now that we are fully into the hour, I'll welcome all of you once again to this live presentation in the member community, the Planetary Society online digital member community. If you are catching us after the fact, if you're watching the recording of this live stream, we welcome you as well, whether you are members or not. But if you're not members, you should be aware that you, as a member, would be able to join us in the member community and all the wonderful activities that take place here. And you'd be able to participate in these live events, which we are offering on a pretty regular basis now. A lot of fun with them. In fact, you can make it interactive by sending us your questions and comments, as many of our live viewers are doing right now in the chat. Those are being monitored by Nicole Barnes. She's going to be feeding some of those to us across the hour, but we do encourage you to send in your questions if you're with us live. And we want to warn you, this is an advocacy and policy review of our activities and looking out toward the future. We are getting some questions about like new forms of propulsion. I'm sure that Casey and Jack could wax poetic about that topic, but only perhaps we should expect them to do so where that crosses into considerations of policy and advocacy. So we'll stick to those topics in particular. Jack, you've been very busy in DC. It seems like you spend at least as much time on the Hill as at home. And I have a couple of images here, which I could try to share my screen very quickly. And do these represent some recent activity?
Yeah, they do. So in the last, really the last 2 weeks, we've had two very successful Hill days where we've engaged members of Congress. So here we have, this was actually just 2 days ago with two team members from the two Venus missions. So Stephen Kane on the left there is a science team member for Da Vinci, which is being run out of the Goddard Space Flight Center and is the first U.S. probe of the Venusian atmosphere since 1978. And Darby Dreier, who many of you might be familiar with from her few interviews on Planetary Radio, is the deputy principal investigator for the Veritas mission. And that is the Venus orbiter that we helped save last year, that was told to stand down with an indefinite launch date sometime in the 2030s or beyond. And we were able to get it in the appropriations package, even in a very tough budget year, as these last two fiscal years have been for planetary science. We were able to get funding in there to restart Veritas in fiscal year 2025, which is the fiscal year that we're in right now. And so both of those missions are on track for a 2031 launch date. But there are, as always with budget crunches, the rumors circulating at NASA headquarters that potentially these missions might get delayed further. And that would have reverberating consequences throughout the space industry and throughout the space science community, and would delay the science from both of those missions by multiple years. 1 year delay at this point is multiple years delay in the science return from them. So we brought them to the Hill to talk about the Venus missions and why it's important to support those as part of a larger, robust planetary science budget. And then here we have next to me, I'll go from right next to me, so immediately to my right in this photo, that's Dr. Ben Fernando from Johns Hopkins. We have Ruby Patterson from University of Houston, and Clive Neal, Dr. Clive Neal from University of Notre Dame. All three of them were here in Washington, D.C. to talk to, we talked to almost a dozen congressional offices, leadership offices, and committee staff talking about the Viper mission, which I know a lot of people were excited about. It's really the first U.S. robotic rover on the moon. It was supposed to go later this year atop the Griffin lander, which is being built by Astrobotic. But due to delays and budget crunches at NASA proposed canceling it in July. And immediately following that, Ben actually kicked off a letter that we got looped in with and helped circulate on Capitol Hill that almost 5,000 people signed in support of asking Congress to reinstate the Viper mission and support the science of the Artemis campaign, which, as we all know, is the top priority for NASA right now. It's been expressed multiple times in the president's budget, in statements from Administrator Nelson. Getting humans back to the lunar surface, the 13th and 14th person on the lunar surface, is a high priority for the administration, but keeping science as a part of that. And Viper really is that science leg. And so bringing both of those groups, the Venus scientists and lunar scientists, to the Hill gave us an opportunity to engage congressional staff in something that they're maybe not normally steeped in, right? They might be talking about transportation one day, healthcare another, but they very rarely are talking about space science. So we were bringing the science to them to talk about why these missions are so compelling and why we shouldn't just delay these things to save a couple bucks this year, but really we need to be redoubling our efforts to invest in space science at a time when budgets have been shrinking. We've lost over $1 billion in buying power since fiscal year 2020, and really just, need to turn the tide on this. Similar to, as Casey was talking about 10 years ago, right? In summer of 2012, when he started, NASA was in a tough place, but we were able to capture the enthusiasm of the scientific community and of the general public to turn the tide for science.
There's something else that is implicit in both of these images, and it is this ongoing, really right from our creation, relationship of the Planetary Society to the leaders of missions, the leaders of planetary science, and the leaders of NASA, that they look to us to back up their work, and they know that they have a good partner in the Planetary Society.
They do. They do. I mean, that's part of our purpose, right? Is to share in the wonders of the cosmos. And who better knows that best than the people who are operating the missions and analyzing the data from the missions that are currently in operation, or even in some cases, missions that have been defunct, like the Magellan spacecraft, which has been, deorbited into the Venusian atmosphere 30 years ago this week. And we're still getting valuable insights about Venus today because of the data collected by Magellan. And so these spacecraft the impact lives much longer than their operational lifespans, even in extended mission. And so being connected with the scientific community, it's a key part of what we're working on here.
Guys, I said at the top of the hour that I'm wearing this tie, with apologies to our Canadian and international members, because of the momentous occasion that is going to take place here in the United States in just over 2 weeks. And that, of course, being our national election. It is going to bring big changes. Casey, you've often talked about this. I mean, no matter what the outcome is, and I know that you've been thinking a lot about this.
Yeah, it's been on my mind a little bit here and there. Either way, we'll have a new administration. We will have I think, Jack, what's the exact number of guaranteed new members of Congress next year due to retirements alone?
14%.
14% of Congress will be new, no matter what happens. And then, of course, if people lose their reelection bids, it'll be greater than that. So we have a real opportunity to reintroduce ourselves to the next administration. Even though kind of both are running, Jack has actually a good article that will be coming out, is it tomorrow or Friday, on comparing the potential space policy administrations of the two presidential candidates. I've had people on Planetary Radio Space Policy Edition to talk about them as well. And as you know, space isn't a huge motivating aspect of this election. It rarely is of any election, but there's some conclusions we could probably draw from it. And there's details we can talk about. But either way, the society will be working with whoever will be elected. And we are preparing a number of documentation and briefings and introductory packages for new members of Congress to work with the transition team of whoever wins the election. And then, of course, providing a series of recommendations for top issues and priorities of the next administration. We've heard from people on both sides of the aisle that getting Artemis on track is going to be the major issue that will define the next 4 years of space policy, of civil space policy, in addition to working with increasing commercial capabilities and science, getting NASA science back on track. There's a lot of very promising things that need to be, in a sense, tweaked. And that will be the big kind of standing issue. So yeah, there's a lot of work coming up ahead, and maybe, Matt, this is the time just to mention that we have this also ulterior motive just that we're talking about at the same time, which is that as a member-funded organization, we are raising funding right now for this activity. A lot of you may have received stuff in the mail asking you to support fundraising opportunity for our advocacy program. For those of you who have already done so, thank you so much. We really, really rely on this. And it allows us to really engage at this deep level that we just highlighted with Jack, who is taking, that takes a lot of work to plan all those meetings and to take key scientists from key missions that are being threatened and having them meet with the key individuals in Congress who could decide their fate. We're facilitating these interactions that no one else is doing. And this is the type of thing I think that makes us really unique as an organization and really valuable as an organization. And again, kind of opening with that memory of Europa Clipper, that took years of constant effort to make the case. And this stuff doesn't just happen on its own. So I'll put in a plug for those of you who are sympathetic and want to help support us, that now is the time to do that. And your donations to our activities mean a lot, because we don't have big corporate funding and we don't take government funding. And so everything we do is based on our members.
Planetary.org/take action. That's one word, take action. To be able to take action, the best action you can take to support your society in continuing its successes in Washington, D.C., in the space policy area. We do so much great stuff, but there's nothing that I'm prouder of that makes me any prouder than our space policy and advocacy work that we've accomplished for nearly 45 years. You'll be hearing more about that anniversary in the coming days, by the way. And this is it. It's your chance to participate. Some of you watching live may have received a message, a letter or email about this as recently as this morning. And we won't push it across the whole hour, but we just might remind you before the end of the hour about planetary.org/take action. If you go there, you can read much more about what your gifts, your donations will accomplish. And of course, basically, they'll be accomplishing pretty much all the stuff that you'll hear Casey and Jack talking about over the next few minutes. Guys, I also want to make sure that we get to the questions, that some of which were submitted prior to us going live and that are coming in now. Nicole is already beginning to share some. One of them I can summarize that has come from a number of people, and we get it every time we have one of these events, and people who want to know how they can participate more directly, not just by making their donations in support of our work, but hands-on. And maybe even feet in Washington. Do you have something you can tell us about another opportunity coming up to do that?
Me?
Sure. Sorry, I should have specified. I'm thinking day of action, of course.
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah, we are scheduling our day of action, our opportunity to meet with members, your elected officials, the new ones that you may have next year, with us, with me and Jack and other members of the Planetary Society. March 24th, 2025 is the scheduled date for that. Tickets will go on sale at the end of the day, and we will share the link here as soon as they're available.
Jack, this is, some of our listeners are going to be tired of hearing this repeated, but could you review why this is so effective, getting our members, regular folks, to show up there in the offices of their representatives?
Absolutely. So our day of action is, I would argue, one of the most impactful things that we do in space policy and advocacy. It is the thing that when I go in to meet with a congressional staffer for the first time, normally they say, I think I've met, when I ask them, oh, have you heard of the Planetary Society before? They say, I think we met with some of your members just a few months ago. And this is something that really makes a significant impact, because it shows that space is not just, you know, the folks who work in the space industry, right? Our friends over in the commercial space industry also have a presence here in Washington, D.C. It's not just the folks that rely on grants, whether from NASA or NSF, which, you know, also have their presence here in D.C., but it's actual just regular people, right? Not connected to any special interest, which of course, you know, that has its place in this process, but the public has a role to play in charting the course for space policy. And because the Planetary Society exists in the space that we do, pun intended, where we're sort of in this independent role that we are able to look at these issues of space policy through a critical lens and sort of determine what the best path forward would be from a policy angle. You taking those recommendations, we give you a inclusive training, full day, you know, noon to 6 p.m. training the day before our day of action, and get you read up on all the materials and issues that are currently facing the space enterprise. But then you bring your passion and that enthusiasm, that the joy that you have in experiencing a new image from the James Webb Space Telescope, or new image from the surface of Mars, or new results from orbiters around outer planets. That really matters and actually makes a difference, because, you know, like I said, these members of Congress and their staff are talking about healthcare and transportation and veterans benefits, all very worthwhile things that the federal government's involved in, but not as uplifting and emotionally satisfying as looking out into the cosmos and seeking to answer those questions. Are we alone, and where did we come from?
Casey, a lot of people can't make it to DC, of course. Could you just say a word about other opportunities that we offer?
Absolutely. And we try to accommodate all ways of communicating. And of course, your standard bread and butter is just writing your representative. And so we have online petitions right now that you can sign. Nicole will drop that into the chat here. Yep.
There it is.
That are talking about, and they're tuned specifically for what is going on right now at the end of fiscal year 2025 appropriation cycle, which, even though we're in fiscal year 2025, Congress has extended last year's funding for a few months to cover themselves through the elections, at which point they'll come back in December and hopefully finalize it. So there's still opportunities to weigh in. We have a House proposed budget for NASA. We have a Senate proposed budget for NASA, and they have to reconcile the two of them together. So this is a great time to write. All the congressional staff who are not doing elections don't have much else to do right now, so they will be reading your letters coming in. And even if your person who's in office now does not get reelected, they will still be here in December. Congress doesn't turn over until January 3rd of next year. So this is a great time to write. Most of you should have gotten an email from us this morning prompting you to do this. And again, it's a great way to do it. There's also opportunities to call your office. And then we even recommend, and you can reach out to us or take our online class, Space Advocacy 101, here in the member community, about ways that you can both strategically align your messaging tuned to your representative, and also find ways to go meet them at town hall events, reach out to them directly. I always love to use this at my personal example. When I moved just north of Seattle, I have a member of Congress who is not known for being on a space. He's not on a space or science committee, but we reached out to him, me and my spouse, and we introduced ourselves and said we cared about space. And the first thing he did was whip out his cell phone, and he on himself had a picture of the Curiosity rover landing taken by MRO right underneath the parachute on his phone. He said, "This is just the coolest thing. I had no known connection about why I should care about this in my district, and now I do." That's literally the best case scenario. I think not every one's experience will be like that, but the point is you don't know unless you try. And reaching out, particularly to your member of Congress, maybe not right. I mean, during election season, they'll be pretty busy. But come the next few months, there's lots of opportunities to stay engaged. And we give you those tools with Space Advocacy 101.
Let me give that URL, since people who aren't watching this live are not going to be able to catch it in the chat. It's simple. It's planetary.org/action-center. This time it's not just all one word. planetary.org/action-center, and you can explore all of these opportunities that Casey has just been talking about. We encourage you to take a look, members or not. Or you just go to planetary.org and hunt around a little bit. You'll find it there because it's easy. Right up at the top is a main menu choice called Take Action. All right, we should probably start getting to some of the questions that are coming in, and I'm going to start by going to some of the stuff that came in before we went live, including Richard in Pennsylvania, a state that's getting a lot of attention prior to the election right now. He had a couple of questions for us. He happens to be a state Senate candidate in Pennsylvania, and he's looking for opportunities that could be more state-based. That's one question. He's talking about maybe stuff through universities, fellowships, residencies. He also says, though, well, first he says, thanks for figuring out where I fit in. I'd just like to know what a commonwealth with little space infrastructure could do to be on the forefront. I think the university system needs to provide more fellowships. So any comments, any thoughts, guys?
Absolutely. There's a number of things. First, I think Pennsylvania is actually an amazing example of the growing coalition of new space and commercial space industry developing around the country. You have Astrobotic, of course, in Pennsylvania, and other classic supply chain and providers in space. You have a very strong university system, and every state has what's called a NASA Space Grant Office, usually at the main research institution. And that is provided through federal grants, and those monies are actually used to support student activities, rocket clubs, scientific research grants for student opportunities to engage in this. I think, and this has been my personal interest, so I know a lot of planetary scientists in particular. I know a lot of them that work at universities that aren't known for planetary science. Very few planetary scientists work at a university with a planetary science department. It's such a new field that they tend to exist in physics or astronomy or geology departments. Having institutional support from the state to hire strategic areas such as planetary science, to set up strategic areas of research such as planetary science and astronomy, can be really powerful and useful when you're in the state. You also have, and the way that I've always seen this, is strategically seeding planetary scientists who work, particularly ones who are working on missions at universities that don't classically have that discipline. That actually acts, think of like drawing a magnet and over some material and having all the magnetic stuff coming out of the blue and stick to it. That's planetary science. That's a mission opportunity. Students will come out of the woodwork who never saw themselves as having an opportunity to participate in space science. Or who are at that university because of cost or family considerations or others, any number of reasons that they're not going to the big research institution. Giving all types of students pathways at every level of a state institutional university system opens up so much opportunity and gets people so excited. And it really absolutely does work. And it creates a pathway that, again, students don't even know to choose for themselves. often who are at those institutions. And so I think really pushing to invest in, it doesn't have to be as specific as planetary science, but science space as a strategic investment at a university state level that the state controls funding for, I think can have huge repercussions and opportunities throughout the state.
I love that magnetic metaphor. That works really well. Let me go to another one here from Craig, who's also in Pennsylvania. He'd like an updated status on Dragonfly. Hasn't seen any recent news on it. Again, sticking with policy and the things we advocate for, clearly we are big fans of the Dragonfly mission. Do you guys, are there any current challenges or things proceeding on toward the launch, which is still some years off?
Yeah, I believe 2027, 2028 is the
28, July of 28, I think I saw, yeah.
Yeah, so there hasn't been, since earlier this year when Dragonfly passed key decision point C, putting it into confirmation, basically saying, NASA saying, this is our next New Frontiers mission. We are going to start building this thing. That was earlier this year, I want to say March or April. There hasn't been any public updates. It is in the president's budget request for fiscal year 2025, of course, at a level higher to necessitate actually buying the materials to build the spacecraft. Making sure that that budget line gets fully funded is one of our top priorities for the remainder of fiscal year 25, because as Casey mentioned, we're currently operating under a continuing resolution. Which basically means that fiscal year 24 funding just carries on through for as long as that continuing resolution exists. And that's through December 20th. And so hopefully the Congress can pass a budget that includes that funding level requisite with the president's budget request for actually starting to do work on the Dragonfly mission.
Yeah, I'll add to this that Dragonfly, the technical term, as Jack said, is Key Decision Point, KDPC. And that moves the whole project from what's called formulation, basically design, into implementation, bending metal and silicon and whatever, right? And building the actual thing. Historically, once missions have gone into phase C, they generally continue and launch. That's about as ensconced as you can get, always understanding that something wild could go wrong, but it's very unusual for a mission to get defunded or canceled after it's met that mark, because it's what's called an agency level commitment to funding the mission. So NASA is formally saying, we are building this. We know how to do it. We've got the plan. We're making the contracts. And I would say it's also got very strong political support from the Maryland congressional delegation. They're very aware of it. Jack and I, particularly Jack, engages frequently with his colleagues at the Applied Physics Lab, which is building the mission in Maryland, part of Johns Hopkins. And so we follow their needs very closely, and I am very confident that they have the resources and, at least at the moment, agency commitment to move forward with the mission. So we're not hearing a lot about it right now because they are in the middle of it. Their hardest work is just beginning. Because now they have to build what they've designed, and they have to do it on time and to the schedule they proposed. So we'll see more probably once they hit phase D, which is assembly. Phase D is when you see all the parts they've been working on in different parts of the country come together and start to fit together, and you start to see a spacecraft emerge. That will probably be in a year or two. And that mission, I'll just add, has become, so it was selected in what's called New Frontiers, right, which is a competitively selected mid-range mission class of planetary science, roughly around $1.5 billion. That is no longer the case in terms of that rigid cost cap. Turns out was not that rigid because the mission has been baselined at, I think, $3.4 billion. That's more than the Perseverance mission. So we have basically a secret flagship class mission going to Titan, masquerading as a New Frontiers mission, which I'm not upset about because this is just an amazing mission. I was just kind of amazed they convinced anybody it would be a lower cost mission, because it's like an octocopter flying on the moon of Saturn that's powered by plutonium.
Yeah,
it does not sound cheap to me.
No big deal.
But that actually does place that the consequence of that, though, is as we are trying to spin up the next generation, this decade's next flagship missions after Perseverance, after Europa Clipper, we basically have a flagship level mission in terms of costs suddenly slotted into that plan. That makes it financially, particularly given what Jack was talking about in terms of the loss of buying power through inflation and budget cuts, a lot harder, or a much bigger push to get through. So, we can talk a bit about Mars sample return. We can talk a bit about the Uranus orbiter and all the other missions NASA's trying to do. But Dragonfly, again, seems to be in a very, very good place, both politically and from an agency level commitment.
I got to spend a couple of days doing some interesting work with Elizabeth Zibby Turtle. Most of us know her as Zibby, who's the science lead for Dragonfly at APL. And she is thrilled by their progress, very optimistic, and very appreciative, very grateful for the support of the Planetary Society as well. Here's one from Sean, and it was Sean who asked about new propulsion systems. Do we have a position on supporting NASA's development of warp drive, guys?
I'm for it.
I'm pro warp drive.
I mean, that's yes. I may point you, if you're interested in that, to a Space Policy Edition podcast I did a few years ago on nuclear propulsion that I had with Bhavya Lal, who was herself an incredible policy person. She was the first AA Associate Administrator at NASA for Space Policy and Strategy in a department she helped devise. She was on the transition team under Biden. And her background is in nuclear physics and space policy. And she led a report about various types of both thermal and electric nuclear propulsion that I find are really fascinating and have a lot of interesting implications, because there is funding for it. This is, so I don't know. This is where, as you said, Matt, I can talk about the policy of this ad nauseum as long as you'd like. I could probably talk about this. I am not an engineer because that's why I became a policy person. It's a lot harder to build that stuff. But we do have, through NASA's technology directorate, the STMD, that they are funding both thermal and some electric propulsion work. Now, it's relatively modest, but NASA has partnered with the Space Force and defense side to work on a joint nuclear thermal propulsion demonstration mission sometime in the next 10 years. So there's progress happening there. There's a lot of technical challenges. There's a lot of cost challenges, probably regulatory and other issues, right? Because it's fissile material. But, and I'll add to this too, in addition to propulsion, there's a lot of need for, as Artemis moves forward, fission power on the surface of the moon, where you have 2 weeks of darkness, right? Every 2 weeks. And you have every month, you have 2 weeks of darkness. And so you need to have some sort of power systems capable of surviving that nighttime. And that's a very, very important and also kind of complementary area of research that's going on right now.
Jack, as you spend time on the Hill, does this topic come up? I mean, support for not just new propulsion, but energy sources that we're going to need on the moon and, fingers crossed, Mars?
Yeah, it certainly does. It seems to be every congressional hearing on the NASA budget or the NASA program, there's always at least one or two questions specifically about nuclear propulsion. So there is an interest, and I think more broadly, especially in sort of the current iteration of Congress, with the current, we'll say, tenor of the space program leaning more towards commercialization, there's a lot of discussion about how can we find key technology areas to open up new markets for commercial companies to get involved with. All under really this idea that the more options that you have, right? In the case of, like, say, the human landing system, we have the two that have been selected by NASA. You have SpaceX human landing system and then Blue Origin's Blue Moon lander. And with kind of this idea that the more options that you have, that's going to drive down costs for NASA, but then open up the possibility that there are going to be these, this future cislunar economy is another topic that comes up very frequently. And so fission power on the surface is obviously, if you're going to have a business park on the south pole of the moon, mining helium-3 or whatever the business model is, you're going to need these advanced energy technologies. And so it comes up fairly frequently as sort of here's this pathway to getting a sustainable, crewed presence on the lunar surface and in cislunar space.
Let me go to a question from Bob, and it's one where we saw an interesting development just this morning in a news release from NASA. What's the latest on Mars sample return? I don't know which of you wants to jump in. Casey, we'll start with you.
I think Jack is all over this. He's the one who sent me the press release this morning.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mars sample return, we had a huge development just today, as Matt said. So, we've been waiting with in great anticipation for these industry studies. So NASA back earlier this year had selected 7 different companies to produce a study on a lower cost, tighter turnaround Mars sample return architecture. They just recently, just last month, added Rocket Lab as the 8th industrial partner in that. Then there is a cross NASA study, a JPL-led study, and an APL-led study. And so in sum, we have 11 different studies on how to do Mars sample return, seeing as how the previous architecture, which included many complex components, was going to run north of $11 billion and not get the samples back in the nice little tubes, right, that are sitting on the surface of Mars until 2040. So we just got news today that the Mars Sample Return Strategic Review Team, I don't know how we are going to pronounce that acronym, MSRSRT, is going to begin reviewing these proposals as they've just been returned to NASA. Unsure whether any of these proposals are going to become public. I do know that a few of the slide decks that some of the companies use, specifically I know the Boeing slide deck was made public a few months ago. So unsure what the level of public involvement in this process is going to be, but the MSR SRT is being headed up by former NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, who was the NASA Administrator under President Trump. So this is a very important milestone in the future for Mars sample return. This is a group of people, it's I think 7 people total, who are going to be making a recommendation to the incoming administration, whomever that is, about what the path forward for MSR should be. And it will be up to that administration, whether the Harris administration or Trump administration, to decide what that architecture looks like and make that commitment to whatever the cost and schedule of that is going to be.
Interestingly, there was also another team, so I think a slightly larger team, that I think was going to be asked to do analysis of and report back, I suppose, to the higher level team. And both of these teams have people who I think it's safe to say are friends of the Planetary Society, certainly people who we interact with regularly and have been guests on Planetary Radio and elsewhere.
Yeah, so yeah, there's the appointed strategic review team, which is mainly aerospace professionals, some retired, some currently working. I know there's 2 folks from MIT. There's folks from former NASA officials. All over the aerospace industry who are going to be in that sort of top level, making that final recommendation. And then NASA has appointed itself a team of about 10 people in an analysis team. The SRT is going to be able to appoint other working groups if they so desire. But the notional timeline right now is to get a recommendation to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue by the end of 2024. And so that'll mean that it'll be fresh off the press for January 20th when the new president is sworn in.
Casey, can you say something about the international implications of Mars sample return, both the fact that, the plan, which has now been nixed, was an international team, and also the fact that China appears to be moving straight ahead toward sample return?
Yeah, so I also want to address John, I'm sorry, the last name, Katsinas, mentioned something that I think is worth adding into this discussion at this point too, which is what is NASA looking for in this review? And so it's worth revisiting, how we got to this point. Jack alluded to the original plan, which was supposed to be, I'm old enough to remember when it was called the Lean Sample Return Architecture back in 2017, ended up projecting to cost $11 billion before it really got into the meat of it. And so very likely would have gone more than that. And it just kind of collapsed under its own weight. And NASA did two things. They went to an internal study that recommended basically adding more money and time to it. And then they went out to industry and said, does anyone else have any ideas? Basically was the tone of the RFI. And so that's going to be hard. This is, I think, so John asked, like, what are the consequences for better or poorer quality? And I think this is going to be the key challenge. Whereas, and I wrote about this, maybe Nicole can drop this in. There's a reason why public space agency does science missions, and we don't have the commercial marketplace do that for us. That's not to say there aren't private companies involved in it, but they're all working for NASA designs and ultimately NASA funding, because these are one-off missions with no long-term commercial exploitation or contract capabilities. It's very, very different than how we approach human spaceflight. Missions like MSR or Europa Clipper, they're designed, they start with the questions they're trying to answer and then work backwards and design a system to answer those questions. Different planets have different questions. You have different systems and you work backwards from those. So there's no economies of scale you can get. And there's no market at Europa. There's no market.
Oh, hello, Casey. Huh. Jack, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can
Casey,
hear
you're
you.
back.
There we go.
My
Or is he
microphone's
back?
doing that
Yeah,
thing again.
sorry. We had a little
thank you for letting me know.
drop
My
out
point
of a
is
few
that the goal of Mars sample return is to get these samples back. We have one collection of samples that have been collected very assiduously by the Perseverance rover since 2021. And so that is not, you have to get those samples back. You cannot fail when you're launching the MAV. You don't have many other chances. You lose those samples, they're gone. And they're collected in a way, these aren't just random rocks that they're picking up off the surface. They are very specifically gathered. I know people on the science team, they, to this day, spend 8 hours a day arguing with each other about where to go and what samples to get. And those arguments can get extremely heated because they're trying to answer the big questions and they're trying to get the samples that will answer those. So the question is, can some kind of hybrid commercial public-private partnership or any other way, what can lower the cost of ensuring we get those samples back? We don't know. And this is, so NASA, I think, is right to do this. $11 billion is a huge ask up front. It would make it the most expensive, probably, science mission ever done. The only comparable one is the Hubble Space Telescope, and that cost, which is about $12 billion, and that includes the multiple upgrades that it had over the years. Behind that is JWST. And so MSR, again, structurally different because all the science is on the back end. You have to get the samples back first to get any return from it. And then also it's a very specific set of, in terms of applied science, it's a very specific community that works on it that then has huge implications for every other planetary scientist and geologist and maybe more. But the actual size of the science community that is invested in the samples is much smaller. So there's a number of just fundamental challenges that have
Casey, you just froze.
to be overcome. So lowering the
Now
cost
you're
is really
back.
important. How they're going to qualify, I don't know. Oh, okay. Well, you got the gist of it. It's hard and it's expensive, and we don't know exactly how they're going to do it. It's not an easy thing, but it's not as simple probably as, with, again, the one big X factor. Do we have a Starship that can land and take off from the surface of Mars? Maybe the Perseverance rover just drives up in it and we bring the rover back with all the samples in it. There's it's hard when you have like a game-changing capability like that that's reliable enough or not.
We will learn more about that as the months roll by, having just seen the most successful Starship test so far, anyway. Casey, I want to give you the chance to plug your next Space Policy Edition show, Friday of next week, because it signifies the importance of these teams of advisors, commissions across the history of NASA, because you're going to have somebody on who has quite a history himself in helping these efforts.
Yeah, so this will be the first Friday of November, which is November 1st. And
I'm sorry. I thought it was going to be the 24th. Sorry about that. We're into November.
That's right. We'll have Norm Augustine, who just recently chaired a committee for the National Academies of Sciences, that evaluated kind of NASA's fundamental workforce and infrastructure. This report, called NASA at a Crossroads, Jack, I think you and I both agree this is a very, very important report that is not getting the coverage it deserves, because the conclusions aren't great. It's basically, this ties into a bigger issue that I've been stewing in my head as I think about what we're going to share with the next leadership of NASA during the next presidential administration, which is state capacity. Can a public institution, does it have the ability to execute the policies and goals that we as a nation ask it to do? NASA carries historically a lot of high expectations and capability, and there's obviously many, many, many smart people who work for NASA. But I think what this report highlights, and it, I think, quantifies a bit what we've been seeing, particularly on the human spaceflight side over the last decade, a slow erosion of capabilities in terms of project management, cost control, capability. And, we have a second mobile launch tower being built for the Space Launch System that will take longer than it took to go to the moon in the first place. It will take 9 years and cost almost $2 billion to build the tower. That tells me that there's something wrong with NASA's state capacity, right? And this report addresses that from both the workforce and kind of infrastructure. So this, to me, I think, may be one of the most important undercurrents within all of space policy right now. And it has a lot to do, and a very provocative thing that this report said, which I think is why it's unpopular, or at least easily to ignore right now, is that NASA may be farming out too much early R&D work, research and development work, to commercial companies. So implicit within that is things like SpaceX, stuff like Astrobotic and other things. And what's happening is that NASA is creating its own competition. And the best NASA engineers and scientists are leaving to work at private companies. And so it's actually accelerating its own workforce issues while simultaneously losing the ability to operate and control its own destiny. I think there's something really interesting there that I hope to talk to Mr. Augustine about, but also I think for all of us to really think about. And so I had an article recently, again, to plug that space science, why NASA does space science and not the commercial sector. There are things that NASA will always have a responsibility to do that just institutionally or structurally commercial capabilities won't be able to do. Fundamental science and exploration is one of those. What we're seeing is, I think, a desire and a trend to offset cost risk at NASA at the expense of institutional risk, reputational risk, and long-term capabilities risk. Those haven't been priced in. They've just been focused on cost. And I think there's, again, I don't have necessarily a resolution to this, because you cannot deny, and I think we shouldn't ignore, how incredible and capable our private sector has been. So what does it say if there's no viable counterpoint in the public sector to say, we want to do what NASA does best? Can they do anything best? Like, we want them, can they continue to do that well while we have a vibrant sector? So that's what I think, finding that line for me is going to be really interesting. And again, Planetary Society, we just are really interested in the space science, exploration, these big picture things. These are our feel-good, inspirational, broad things that you don't necessarily make money from, but have value nonetheless. And that requires a certain amount of public investment, because that is the role of a public institution, as opposed to a profit-making institution. So this is where my mind has been.
That is going to be a space policy edition, not to be missed, with Norm Augustine. You said November 1st. It's our monthly policy program, and there are always wonderful guests there, but that should be fascinating. Guys, as always, you provide wonderful insights, and I'm hoping that you're able to stick around for a few minutes past the hour so that we can get to a few more of the questions that are coming in from our live viewers here in the member community. Let me get to one of those right now from Mel. Are there policy implications, this is a long one, are there policy implications and or advocacy implications raised by the behavior of the CEO of the aforementioned SpaceX in his unfettered support of one U.S. presidential candidate? Could this cause harm in terms of government contracts? And how can we perhaps save the entire commercial space program? And then there's a comment here about Boeing, which I won't add. But guys, it's the elephant in the room when you talk about SpaceX, I suppose. We see the tremendous accomplishments that the company is making, but it does have a rather controversial leader, officially the chief technology officer, but also the person who holds all the cards when it comes to that company.
Yeah, so it's a very unique situation, right, to be in. But I think what's important to remember here is, in part, Elon Musk is doing his political activism through campaign contributions and rally appearances and Facebook ads in his personal capacity, right? And I think that there has been, what I've seen through combing through FEC reports and checking what everybody's doing, that SpaceX is kind of existing separate of Elon's personal political ambitions, which is great to see. It's, space is something that has historically been a very nonpartisan and not really polarizing, policy area. And so it's great to see that continues to carry through. I, as an advocate for space and a citizen of the United States, am concerned, right? I think rightfully so, about space becoming overly partisan or overly politicized. It's certainly something that is a priority for both, and as Casey mentioned, I have an article coming out about this. It's a priority for both the Democratic and Republican parties. Making sure that distinction is made, I think, is very important. So SpaceX has not been involved, obviously, as most corporate entities in the year 2024, has its own political action committee, but is completely separate from what Elon Musk is doing in his personal capacity. And we have, just remember, we're currently in a Democratic administration that Elon personally has been railing against, yet has awarded multiple new contracts to SpaceX just in the last few years. And so clearly there has not been a breakdown of communication between what SpaceX wants to do in space and the needs of the federal government.
Casey, I want to let you comment, but I do want to throw in at least a mention of the amazing Gwen Shotwell, who runs the company on a day-to-day basis, is not distracted by building electric vehicles or running a social network. So she doesn't get enough credit.
Absolutely. And I think she has been possibly, if not the key, one of the most important people ever at SpaceX in terms of managing and winning contracts and running it and ensuring the operations are smooth. It was interesting listening to the pre-launch briefing for the Europa Clipper, which launched on the SpaceX Falcon Heavy. And you hear just the easy back and forth and totally confident and capable sounding staff of SpaceX personnel working and interfacing with the NASA personnel. And they had nothing but nice things to say about each. I mean, they clearly work together very closely and get along well. And that's a good reminder of what Jack is saying, is that the company itself has been doing incredible service for NASA and is incredibly professional to work with. That said, I think there's something really fascinating at play here in terms of what policies could be. And, Elon Musk's political evolution is all the more kind of wild. I don't know if anyone listened to my last interview with Lori Garver, who was on the last episode. She's a Democrat and worked for Democratic administrations, has campaigned for them. And she was one of the, it was the Obama administration that really doubled down on commercial crew as the path forward for NASA against very strong Republican opposition in the early 2010s. And the contract that NASA gave to SpaceX for commercial crew saved the company. And it's not me just making Elon Musk has said that literally. Without that they would not be SpaceX. And that was at the beginning of the Obama administration. So this is what I kind of mean about the policies of creating a vibrant space sector that NASA has actually, or Lori Garver, kind of personifying this motivation, has kind of created the antithesis of her political belief structure through empowerment of that organization and individual by these policies to lower the cost of launch for NASA. I think, again, that's really fascinating. It's like story. It looks like the personal relationship between Elon Musk and Trump is quite strong. And this is where I think in terms of policy for the next administration, like a lot of things with Elon Musk, he plays high risk, incredibly high reward plays. And he knows in a sense that the government has a complete reliance on SpaceX right now. There are no other alternatives at the moment. Even though we're about to certify Vulcan, at the moment, there is one company that can launch things into space in the United States. And a handful, there's a handful of Atlas Vs left over, but those are all spoken for. So, in a sense, he knows that the Democratic administrations, they have to use SpaceX. There's nothing else. Similar kind of power through Starlink building out in terms of controlling the destinies of Ukraine and other nations, not to mention flood victims and storm victims in North Carolina and elsewhere. And so at the same time, he wants to go to Mars, and that's what Trump has talked about. Whenever Trump has spoken extemporaneously about space, he talks about Mars. He never really talked about the moon. Ironically, though, his administration started Artemis, and that was really through kind of Mike Pence and people within and without NASA. And so there's an opportunity, I imagine Elon Musk sees, if Trump comes in and maybe with Republican majorities in House and Senate, that he could theoretically reorient NASA to a Mars program exclusively, which would more align with his interests and SpaceX's interest with Starship, and rid himself of all these other kind of having to develop a lunar lander and whatnot. He will have the president's ear to do that. And he will be the one helping to reduce regulations for his own companies, it looks like. And so and again, I'm not being pejorative, and I'm not trying to cast this in a political way. I'm just looking at this in an analytical way. He will have the ear to do that, and these are what he has expressed. And he will have opportunity to do that. So I think that's this is, again, like a lot of things with Elon Musk, unprecedented and ahistorical. Mm-hmm. And so we don't exactly know, but I think that may be influencing a lot of the motivation to the degree that he has. So he has an incredible, he knows the government relies on him. And so that's the other interesting thing I think about US policy over the years, which has always been to create a vibrant commercial space sector. The intent with commercial cargo and crew was to have a vibrant competitive sector of commercial launch for the government. And right now that doesn't exist. It created a new monopoly of SpaceX, which has saved the government lots of money, incredible capability. But the other SpaceXs have not shown up to play yet. Maybe they'll get there. Blue Origin obviously will be launching New Glenn. We're seeing Vulcan and ULA reconfigure itself. We're seeing Rocket Lab go for a mid-sized launch. There's other options, but again, at the moment, SpaceX is the monopoly launch provider, and that has consequences.
I'm going to jump to a question that you've now partially answered, Casey, from Robert, who says, I don't recall if I heard a clear answer on the two recent space policy editions about how the two potential administrations view the Artemis Accords. Can you guys shed some light on that?
Go for it, Jack.
Happy to. I think the Artemis Accords have been embraced very publicly by leadership in both political parties. And I think highlights NASA's evolving role as a tool of soft power and of means to build a diplomatic coalition against what is perceived as the largest geopolitical threat to the United States, which is the relationship between China and Russia in space. And I think both parties. I mean, we're at 45 signatures, with Estonia signing earlier this week at the IAC in Milan. And I think just today saw something in Space News about the 45 countries have now come together to talk to other countries that have not yet signed the Artemis Accords to bring them on board. And so I see it as going to continue to evolve. I mean, it was also, Mike Gold who's now at Redwire, but was in the Trump administration, had sort of started the Artemis Accords back in 2019. And was picked up by the Biden administration, has been shepherded around as Administrator Nelson has gone from country to country, working with the State Department to include more folks in that in the Accords. And so I would see it doubling in size in the next 4 years, more than it going away. I see it as both parties have spoken very highly of it. And I think because NASA carries such an amazing brand, it's synonymous with innovation and excellence in technology and science. And so it gives the U.S. this great, very tactile, it's literally 8 pieces of paper that they can carry around from country to country and advocate for the U.S. worldview when it comes to space, which is based in science and sustainability in cislunar space, but also beyond that.
I want to add to that. That's a really interesting point, and I think it's worth noting 3/4 of the signatories have come in the Biden administration, and that may be one of the. I mean, Bill Nelson, NASA administrator, seems to love to jet around and go to other countries and sign the Artemis Accords with them. It's one of his big legacies. And so I think it's been nothing short of a wild success and huge credit. And actually, I'll just talk to Mike Gold about this, the Artemis Accords, the man who helped organize and put them together in Planetary Radio Space Policy Edition, which we do because we have member support, of which we're fundraising right now. So again, please keep that in mind, that these types of things happen because we're able to do them because of your support that you give us. But Mike Gold, to build on what Jack was saying, very purposely, they worked very carefully to make sure that these were nonpartisan, non-political statements that made it straightforward for the U.S. to make these, and they're all bilateral, but they've created a coalition of countries with a shared set of values for lunar exploration. And it's tying Artemis to a broader geopolitical positioning of the United States. It's asserting broad democratic, scientific, and peaceful values in exploration. And it's inviting the world to come along. And I've always said Artemis, for all of its Frankenstein-like assemblage of various programs, it's designed very thoughtfully in that it's providing levels of access for every country that wants to have some kind of association with lunar exploration. So if you're a smaller country or don't have a big aerospace sector or don't have a big budget for your space program, you can join the Artemis Accords. It doesn't cost you anything. You can just, it's basically what country is interested in sharing these values with the US and using that to help raise awareness and align yourself and hopefully build something in aerospace or lunar exploration. 44, 45 countries have done that.
45 now, I think. Yeah.
Gateway allows countries like Japan, ESA, the United Arab Emirates, and others who have solid but not profoundly wealthy space programs to provide and contribute hardware that they know how to make and technology and budget levels they're capable of supporting. And then lunar surface is for those who want to go the full mile, right? And that requires a lot more technology, that requires a lot more cost commitment, in other words. So you have levels of integration and option for this broad global coalition, which ultimately helps Artemis, and this would be, again, should Trump win and Elon Musk tries to talk him out of going to the moon and go to Mars instead, the Artemis coalition will beg to differ, right? And that'll be because it's designed to be a geopolitical stabilizer to allow lunar focus for decades, to allow this kind of infrastructure, institutional and policy establishment of a enduring presence, human presence at the moon.
Nicole continues to post wonderful links to all of these things, most of them episodes of the Space Policy Edition. If you are not watching the chat, if you're watching this after the fact, you can always go to planetary.org/radio and find all those past episodes of SPE that take place monthly, along, of course, with the weekly show hosted by our colleague, Sarah. Guys, I got to tell you, I had Mike Gold on a panel at the Humans to Mars Summit last May, I think it was. And I asked Mike, are the Artemis Accords actually just a sneaky way to get us started on the path toward the United Federation of Planets? And he said, you've uncovered our secret plan. Let me get to a related question from Kareem. Are you saying there is room for both Artemis and Starship, SpaceX, even though there seems like a lot of overlap there? I guess in particular, he's thinking of the Space Launch System, that other giant rocket. Okay, Jack?
I was just going to say there is a lot of overlap, and that's, I think, intentional, because the Space Launch System, right, connected with Orion, is going to launch the people, and Starship's going to launch the lander. And I think that was in large part the design for Artemis, was that it was going to utilize these legacy technologies, right? Space Launch System built on the legacy of Space Shuttle. And then you have Starship, emerging capability. And let's also not forget Blue Origin with New Glenn, and then their Blue Moon lander are going to be developing out commercial capabilities to get down to the lunar surface. And then so it was sort of built to have this overlap so that you had sort of those traditional, NASA contractors, NASA centers engaged in the project, which comes with it a political power, but then you also have the emerging space industry, which is supposed to drive down cost, right? And we've seen in a handful of instances, commercial cargo and crew where it has, and it's returned U.S. To having the ability to get our crew and cargo to the International Space Station instead of relying exclusively on the Russians. So having sort of that overlap is intentional and supposed to be part of that political Artemis coalition. When they do the Artemis Suppliers Day here in DC, it's a big conference of all the folks who are involved in Artemis, from the folks building SLS to the folks working on Starship and the various other, dozens of other contractors working as part of this, return to the moon. It's a huge group of people. They've had to, increase the space in which they're using, and they also engage with Capitol Hill while they're here. And so it is building that political will to keep Artemis going. And not to steal Casey's thunder, but I mean, Artemis being continued from the Trump administration to the Biden administration was a major hurdle for the program and for the space agency. We've not seen that with any return to the moon program since Apollo, where the program was continued between different administrations and different, party affiliations of those presidents.
Do you guys remember the name of the other international coalition, the one that China, Russia, North Korea, Brazil, and several other nations are also joining, although it's certainly not at the level of success of the Artemis Accords? It makes me think of a question that we have from Don. Is there any pressure being placed, or is maybe that the concept of a new space race being used in Washington, in the nation's capital, regarding a space race with China that might play to the egos and interests of DC politicians?
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
called
Oh,
go ahead.
Oh,
Jack.
you got it, Casey?
Yeah, ISLR. It's the International Lunar. ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station.
Thank you.
which is a kind of a competing thing. But yeah, it's smaller, but it has basically a collection of antagonistic to frenemy level nations to the United States geopolitically.
Yeah. So what about, does that ever come up, Jack, in the halls of Congress? We're looking at a new space race. We better get on the ball.
Absolutely. I mean, if you tune into any congressional hearing on NASA, somebody is going to come out and say, we are in a race with China. And I think that is, one, a very convenient and maybe familiar approach to space policy, that we are in a race to do something, right? Because of the success of Apollo, it aligns very closely with that as a maybe messaging tactic. But I think there is a genuine sense that not just in space, so within the House of Representatives, there's a number of what are called select committees, which are created at the will of the majority in the Congress. And one of those select committees is on strategic competition with China. And so that is not just space, but in other areas of public policy. Whether military, right? Obviously, the defense side of things, granted, a head-to-head confrontation with China is the last thing that anybody wants, but it's certainly economic and diplomatic and manufacturing-wise as well, industrial. And so space is one component of, I think, this overall view that is shared by Democrats and Republicans alike, that the US and China are the two global superpowers currently competing for global hegemony. Whether that is overall going to help raise NASA budgets, it really, it's kept Artemis fully funded, but we've seen major cuts elsewhere in NASA's budget, which, to Casey's point earlier, has caused a significant issue with state capacity. NASA is not just Artemis. There's the science program with over 140 missions in operation or in development. It's the aviation program, right? So there's a lot of things that happen at NASA that aren't necessarily directly tied to China. So it is one argument that we hear very frequently, but it is not the only reason that people are investing in NASA.
We are an hour and a quarter into this semi-annual review of the Planetary Society's advocacy and policy activities and the status of things around the world, as we're hearing. So I want to head us toward closing out here. Before we do that, I want to make sure that you guys get a chance to talk about what's currently on your desks, what you're currently working with. But I want to go to a somewhat more philosophical question, if I can find it again here. Here it is. It's from Richard, who we heard from a little bit earlier. Is futurism dead in budget talks without use of the word economy? Could a science renaissance back end a project so that furthering science has more weight in pushing exploration of the cosmos? In other words, does it hold any sway with Congress and the other people who hold the purse strings to say that this is what humans do, we need to explore? I don't know who wants to tackle that, Jack.
I can take that one. I will say a lot of the rhetoric right now in space, and you even see it in what we're publishing, right? We talk a lot about workforce and economic development, economic growth. I think in large part because we are in this very constrained budget. So just going back a little bit, so Congress passed what's called the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which I will say is fiscal responsibility in name only, because it capped the budget, the discretionary, non-defense discretionary budget for the federal government. And that has resulted in over a $500 million cut to NASA science alone, and over $1 billion to NASA. And that's just one of the many things that have been happening just in the past few years that have driven costs up for the space agency, while also creating more downward pressure on a very ambitious program for the space agency. And so I don't think futurism is dead. I like to think of myself as a bit of a futurist, but like in the moment right now, there often needs to be some additional justification that is more terrestrial. Former NASA administrator Mike Griffin called it the real and acceptable reasons for space, right? Mm-hmm. We don't go into space to create jobs in X district in Oklahoma. That is a end result, right, of our investment in space exploration and space science. And so I don't think that we are beyond a point where the nation can do things that are hopeful and future focused. I think when you hear the rhetoric on Capitol Hill, a lot of times the thing that gets people most excited about space, really about anything in the federal government, is about expanding human knowledge, expanding our capabilities to understand the cosmos and our world.
And
so,
to inspire young people.
And inspire young people. And so I don't think futurism's dead in budget negotiations. It's tough right now. It's tough across the entire federal government, where it was a 1% increase between fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025. Inflation alone was just 2.4% between those two fiscal years. So we're already operating at a loss. Now, I will say there is some movement on Capitol Hill, primarily in the Senate, which has been acting in a more bipartisan fashion than the House has in the past year when it has come to the budgets, of both Democrats and Republicans railing against these budget caps, because not just for space, though space does get a highlight in some of the reporting on this and public statements, but that these budget caps are hurting the whole of the federal government. And now it's important that we handle our debt properly. It's important that we handle our fiscal situation properly. But investing in things that aren't something like NASA, that really gets to the core of what it means to be human, to look up and wonder, I think there is still an appetite for that. And I think that's where you come in. And coming to the day of action and getting involved in your community, writing letters to your members of Congress, is that your involvement is incredibly important at that level. And coming to DC on March 24th, 2025, link is in the chat, for our day of action, is your way to make that case to members of Congress and their staff. Yeah, there's the economic benefit of space. There's the geopolitical benefit of space. There are all these reasons I say, if there's 100 people in a room, which we normally have for our day of action, if there's 100 people in a room, you have 100 different reasons to support space exploration. But bringing your passion and enthusiasm is what gets that point across to those members and actually tells them that, hey, there are people in my district who came here on their own dime on a random Monday in March to talk to me about this issue. It must be very important to them. So we should take a look at it.
I'll only mention that the vision of the Planetary Society is to know our cosmos and our place within it. And we stick to that, even though we have to deal with practical matters like making sure missions get funded as well. I also want to congratulate and give kudos to Richard, who gave us that, generated this last bit of discussion, who just joined the Planetary Society, he says, 2 days ago. Thank you, Richard. You already obviously are a very active member, and we encourage those of you who are not members watching this after the fact, check us out at planetary.org. And remember that specifically we have this campaign going right now, planetary.org/takeaction, one word, to become part of our current fundraising effort to make sure that Casey and Jack can continue to do this amazing work that you've heard them talking about now for nearly an hour and a half. Guys, tell us, what are you up to right now? What are your current concerns and activities? Casey, go to you first.
Well, obviously the election, as I mentioned at the beginning, that's going to focus a lot of our effort, not the election itself, but the consequences, I should say, of the election. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we don't and can't legally, but we also choose, I don't think we would if we could, support campaigns. We want to work with who's in power, and we are here to represent our members and public interest in this whole process. And I think thinking about what's been really occupying me beyond this practical, okay, we're going to communicate and put out our values and reach out, and a lot of work that Jack will be doing based in DC is going to be the one, he'll be the one showing up at their offices and facilitating these. It's really thinking about these future optimism, why we're doing this, and where that works best. And I think, to kind of build a little bit off of what Jack was saying in the past, or in his last answer, there's different domains where different types of arguments are appropriate. We have a representative democracy that is made up of people who have discrete geographical representation. They are represent their location in the country, and they answer to those citizens and to their constituents. From that assemblage of discrete geographic non-overlapping spots, at least in the House, somewhat in the Senate, you have to find big things that can be argued among a variety of belief structures, motivations, needs, to be worthy of investment and to rise to some level of awareness and focus. This is what Jack alluded to, what are commonly referred to as acceptable or practical reasons for spaceflight. What has, I think, fallen by the wayside a lot in the last few decades that we're seeing resurrected to some degree, and particularly, I think, through people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and others talk about space, is these deeper, harder to quantify, but profoundly important aspects of being alive and being a human, but are motivations that tend to be relevant in the domain of the individual. So exploration, excitement, awe, sublimity, I guess, and the big things that we feel. And so the reasons why I became a member, and I think why a lot of our members are members, is because of those things, because we feel something big. We look at the cosmos and say, we need to go. We need to see what's out there. What an amazing opportunity we have, and that Carl Sagan-esque kind of joy of discovery.
Standing on the shore of the cosmic ocean.
But we then, in advocacy, we then have to deploy arguments of acceptability within a practical policy structure. And there's an interesting tension there, right? So we're here because we feel these big, grand things, and they have a role in the discussion. But ultimately, in a democracy, you have to be able to say, what are we doing that helps the body politic, that helps the country? And so we tend to talk about the practical, even if we're motivated by the ambitious and the awe-inspiring. And I think that's just something to keep in mind. I've been very interested about how those two things interplay and motivations and where we effectively talk about them. And if you can convert, in a sense, members of Congress to feel that individually, they can be very powerfully motivated. But even if they can't be, you can deploy arguments that are practical and relevant and true in order to help, if at least not get the strongest support, benefit what you're trying to do. And I think it also helps us, again, in a democracy, that we have to learn how to present what we believe in with people who share very different worldviews. And so can we apply and think about very useful things, that we get from going out into space? And so that's, I'd say maybe that's where my head is these days, that straightforward thing. But I think it's really important. And I think that's important to remember as advocates. And that when you come to the day of action, or when we ask you to write and you look at the letters that we present, that they can feel practical even if you're motivated by the grand. And that's normal. And I think that's how we do things, is that it's this translation between the individual to the collective, in a sense, and then finding opportunities to invest in those and build them up, and to give us that excitement about the future that I think a lot of people are missing right now.
Jack, I want to hear what's on your plate. And I know that one thing on your plate is something that hasn't yet come up in this discussion, but we had a question or two about, and it's the Planetary Science Caucus, which Casey talked about, bringing in those members of Congress and senators, some of whom may not have the direct relationship with it in their districts or states.
Yeah. So I will just say, I'm going to just say ditto to everything that Casey just said. Trying to capture the enthusiasm and distilling down these values and trying to relate them to people that disagree with us, something I think, as Casey said, fundamental to representative democracy, is, I think, a full-time job in and of itself. And so I have been trying to take the little downtime that we have now to really reflect on these things and try to build up that acumen, that ability to relate to people on multiple levels. I think that the Planetary Science Caucus is going to be top priority starting January 4th. We're going to give them January 3rd to celebrate the beginning of the new Congress, but January 4th, making sure that the Planetary Science Caucus is reestablished in the 119th Congress is a top priority. We're currently sitting at 23 members. Want to get that number up and expand our reach, currently representing 11 different states, have both Republican and Democratic members, House and Senate members. And so continuing to build that list, that roster of people who are excited about this for whatever the reason is, but to really, tap into the enthusiasm that exists, whether it's for the economic development angle or for the geopolitical angle or just the emotional angle that exists on Capitol Hill. I actually heard from one of our great members who's come to the Day of Action now multiple times today, saying that she got an opportunity to talk to a member of Congress earlier this week, and they bonded over the Europa Clipper launch. And I feel like that happens. There's members of Congress up and down both coasts across the country, from sea to shining sea, that are enthused by space advocacy and by space exploration. And if we can capture just even a little bit of that energy, that if I can capture a little bit of that energy that we bring to the Day of Action and just bring that with me every single day, I think we can make a real difference in the 119th Congress and really hit the ground running come January 4th.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll just add on a practical note. I mean, so what in addition to doing that, we are here for you ultimately as members. And one of our goals is to continue and improve on giving you insights and perspectives and understanding how these things work at a fine-grained and practical level, so you can be a better advocate, or at least you can understand the intricacies of how these things all happen. We want to give you things that no one else talks about or overlooks, and we want to give you those opportunities to engage with us and ask these questions, and we want to give you the opportunities to communicate and share your passion with the people who are capable of helping that happen and further it. And so I think at the end of the day, we want to facilitate this interaction between you and your elected officials and you and your knowledge with this. And and I think it's important to state here that not everyone has to feel like they have to come to the Day of Action. It's a big ask. It's a lot of travel. It's expensive. It takes time from work. Jack and I are eternally grateful and also just in awe of the members who are able to come. But if you can't, or you just don't feel comfortable, and it's totally fine, right? It's very extroverted. Not everyone is extroverted. Even if you don't feel like writing, being a member of the Planetary Society puts you in the 99.9 percentile of space supporters in the country, right? Just 'cause you are helping us do our jobs, you donate, that helps. But even just if you're curious and you listen to the podcast or you read Jack and I's blog posts or call into these discussions, we hope to present to you a more nuanced, thoughtful, detailed, and insightful presentation of this information so you understand things in that 99.9th percentile. And I think there's a lot of junk out there, obviously, on the internet, and we hope to cut through that with quality. So that's my commitment to you all as the membership for next year.
I think you gentlemen, have given us lots of evidence in the last 90 minutes or so of reaching exactly that goal, succeeding with it, Casey. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone who's been watching us. I bet a lot of you are as in awe of and as grateful to these humans who represent us in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, to fine examples of the superb staff that we have at the Planetary Society, but the two guys who are most devoted to representing your views, our views, and making sure that we achieve that vision of knowing the cosmos and our place within it. Thank you, everyone, again for tuning in. If you are watching us after the fact, as I said, planetary.org is the place to learn much more. Planetary.org/take-action if you see this in the few coming days ahead, that our campaign for advocacy work and policy work by the society that will continue for a few more days. You have a chance to become part of this in that way as well. We have much more coming up in store for you here in the member community, your member community, including the book club. I'll be talking to Sarah Amari Walker of Arizona State about her great new book, fascinating book that is generating a lot of controversy about what is known as assembly theory, a new way she and others believe that we can look at life's origin and perhaps help us in recognizing it when and if we find it elsewhere. Much more here for you in your community and across all of our different channels at the Society. Again, Jack and Casey, thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you, Matt.
You bet. Casey Dreier is the Chief of Space Policy for the Planetary Society. Jack Pirley is our Director of Government Relations in Washington, D.C. I am Matt Kaplan, Senior Communications Advisor to the Planetary Society. Wishing all of you a great remainder of your afternoon or evening, and thanks again for joining us.